Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about nose gear versus tail drag. Why don't we see any tail drag modern airliners? And also, what does the word taxiing come from? Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on.
Third land, 31 right. Delta 260. Yes, sir, dude.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with Brilliant. Now, if you have found yourself, just like I have during the last few months, trying to homeschool your kids or trying to improve yourself, well then I highly recommend you to go and check out Brilliant. They have more than 60 different courses in things like mathematical fundamentals or the physics of everyday or logic. And what I've been doing lately is that my oldest son, Lucas, I've tried to motivate him doing math. And Brilliant turns out to be really effective in doing that. So I'll put him in front of the logic course. There's some brain teasing kind of nuts to crack, and he will keep working on them. And when he comes up against something that he doesn't understand, well then he can just click the explanation. He get a really good explanation on how to think, and then he'll be able to kind of crack the next one, which is really motivating. Now, those of you who uses this link here below will get a whopping 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, but it's completely free to check it out. So do that and let me know what you think. Alright guys, so today I want to talk about tail drag, which is the conventional landing gear, against the nose gear tricycle configuration on aircraft. So if you go back into the history, you'll see that most older aircraft have the tail drag landing gear. But the more modern they become, the more we'll see the tricycle nose gear configuration. Why is that? Well, it turns out that it has a lot to do with the kind of runways that were in use and the way that aircraft was originally kind of utilized. So if you go back to the birth of aviation and the first couple of decades of aviation, the kind of runways that were used tended to be either big gravel fields or big grass fields. Okay. When you were constructing an aircraft, in order to fly on fields like that, you wanted something sturdy, and you also wanted something that gave a lot of clearance for the propeller. And it turns out that if you equip an aircraft with a tail drag, the conventional landing gear principle, where you have a big set of landing gear in front of the center of gravity, and then you have a tiny little wheel or even just a drag hook at the end of the aircraft, not only do you get a very sturdy kind of landing gear configuration that can take up a lot of potholes and a lot of uneven surfaces, you also get a fairly light and easy to construct configuration. Because it's such a big distance between the center of gravity towards where the tail gear is, you can make the tail wheel very small and very lightweight. All right. So this is why you would see in the early versions of both smaller aircraft, but also the early versions of airliners, they will be using this principle. You'll be taxiing out, and here, when you start to taxi on a conventional gear configuration with the tail drag, this is really where the problems start. You need to have an enormous amount of skill as a pilot in order to taxi these aircraft in the first place, because when you have the steering behind the center of gravity and the center of gravity being behind the main wheels, what you get is an aircraft that on the ground is inherently unstable. If you start to have the tail moving to the left or right, instead of having kind of a stabilizing movement that you get on a nose gear, you will have a destabilizing movement, as in the more it moves, the more it wants to move. All right? So this makes it really hard to taxi the aircraft. It also makes it really hard to land, especially when you're landing in crosswind conditions. Because as you land with the crosswind and you have aileron into the wind and the rudder becomes less and less effective as the speed decreases, if you start to get any kind of movement of the tail, it's very easy to end up with something called the ground loop, which is where that tail just comes rushing from one side and it turns the whole aircraft 180 degrees around. And if that happens at very high speed, well then the whole aircraft can kind of topple over, the wing can dig into the ground, and you can get some really bad damages to the aircraft. And this happens quite often. Okay. Another problem you have is that you will obviously be braking with the main landing gear. And since you now not have a nose gear, it means that if you brake suddenly very hard, there is a potential of the aircraft to kind of just tip forward and bury your propeller or your nose into the ground ahead of you, which has also happened on quite a few occasions. And here, my friends, is where we come to the origin of the word to taxi an aircraft. Because if you think of it, to taxi an aircraft is what we're saying about aircraft that are moving on their own power on the ground. But there are a lot of different vehicles out there who are moving by their own power on the ground. A tractor is driving, a truck is driving, a car is driving, but an aircraft is taxiing. And why is that? I've been digging into this and I've found a really, really compelling and interesting story. The first time that you ever hear the word taxiing about an aircraft movement on the ground is from back in 1911, where there was a French air school, that's in a flight school, that was using a very, very peculiar type of aircraft to train its cadets. Now this aircraft was way too heavy and had way too small engine and actually had the wings configured so that it wouldn't take off. But you could use it to practice to drive the aircraft on the ground. So in the beginning of your flight training, the cadets would get into this aircraft, it would be driving out and then just drive up and down the airfield, trying to make sure that it could handle this ground loop tendency and that it would be smooth on the brakes. So they were just going up and down, up and down. Now, at 1911, seeing aircraft, that was really something that the general public liked. And the general public who was watching this happening, they kind of laughed at this and they said, listen, look at that. That looked like just one of these other new inventions, the taximobile. It looks like one of those taximobiles that are about to, slowly going to pick up a new customer and drive it around. So that's when they started to call this particular aircraft a taxi aircraft, right? So it came from that. People thought that it looked like someone was scouring for customers to pick up. It was also a fact that the cadets obviously were paying to be driving around on the ground. And this is the origin of the word taxi. And it came from the fact that tail drag aircraft are notoriously hard to maneuver on the ground. Fascinating, eh? Cool. So, as these tail drag aircraft started to develop, they saw also that there were issues with, for example, maneuvering during strong crosswinds, for the reason I've already mentioned, but also just taxiing in strong winds was an issue, because as you had a fairly high inclination of the aircraft, which gave an angle of attack effectively, if there was very strong winds outside, you could actually get a lot of lift being developed on one wing, but maybe not the other, and then the aircraft could have a tendency to start actually moving on the ground. So because of all of this, and because they wanted to start to get more forward visibility, especially as there was more and more aircraft around on the ground, they came up with the nose gear configuration. Now the nose gear configuration required a little bit more technology. Because it is less of a distance between the main gear and the nose gear needed to take up a lot more weight, which means that you have to have a nose gear strut, for example. So it became heavier. But with it, you also had much better forward visibility. You had much better, much easier maneuvering on the ground. It was easier to land and just generally easier to deal with. So this is where you start seeing nose gear aircraft or nose wheel configuration undercarriage coming on. You also see it on some of the earlier fighters that was flying out of aircraft carriers, because they had to land on a really, really short distance on the carrier. They noticed that there was a tendency otherwise to just get that head down motion. So there were a lot of reasons for the nose gears to appear, but we have some airliners that have the tail drag undercarriage as well. If you look at the beautiful DC-3, for example, it is flying with a tail gear configuration, and it is an absolutely beautiful aircraft. But if you've ever boarded one of those, we'll come to one of the reasons why we don't see it in modern airliners, and that is that it has a quite sharp incline. So you board that from the back, obviously, because you can't even reach up to the front of it when it's standing on the ground, and you're going to have to climb a fairly steep incline, which is going to slow down boarding significantly if you had that on a modern airliner. Right, so let's have a look now on modern airliners and whether or not we could actually have a modern airliner with a tail drag configuration. So first of all, when we are operating a modern airliner on the ground, it's very important that we have good forward visibility and that we have a low cockpit cutoff angle. Now, a cockpit cutoff angle is the area below the aircraft that the pilots cannot see because the nose is in the way. And the higher of the angle we have of the aircraft, the bigger this cockpit cutoff angle is. So while we might not be able to see in the 737 maybe 15 meters ahead, now if we would have a higher angle, a higher incline as we're taxiing around on the ground, it means that instead of having maybe 15 meters, which we have today, it would be maybe 80 meters, right? And this obviously would be a huge problem as we are, taxiing around on airport, putting ourselves in a queue, for example, in order to get ready to take off. So that's one thing. The next thing, which I think is really, really important, is that incline when you're standing by the gate. Like I've been saying already, it would be hard to get the turnaround times if the passengers are going to be climbing up from one direction and possibly trying to hold themselves going down the other direction. But the main issue here is going to be the loading of cargo. So in modern aircraft, you load cargo either via bulk, which is individual items being thrown into different compartments in the holds, or via container. Container is probably, especially on the bigger airlines, the most common thing, and it's loaded in and then it's being pushed back using these kind of ball rails. That wouldn't be possible in the same way if you had an incline when you're standing at the gate. You would need some kind of pulley system or some kind of thing that would pull or hold the containers as they were coming into place. And it would be just a lot more potentially dangerous, take a lot more time, and be a lot heavier. So that would be a clear downside of having a tail drag. Another thing is the jet blast. So like we were saying, when it comes to using tail draggers on propeller aircraft, it's actually kind of a good thing because you have much more propeller clearance in most cases. But the propeller works by taking a lot of air and kind of accelerating it a little bit backwards. You don't really get that kind of jet blast from a propeller that you'd get from a jet aircraft. So if you put jet engines on a tail drag aircraft, it means that that jet blast, instead of being pointed straight backward, it's now going to be pointed at an angle down towards the ground. And if you're trying to taxi a big heavy aircraft, you have to use a little bit of thrust. These engines are extremely powerful. Those jet blasts are very powerful. And it is very likely that those kind of jet blasts down into the asphalt is going to potentially damage the asphalt, so both the taxiways and the aprons. If they do, they're going to be throwing up pieces of rock and stone onto the horizontal and the vertical stabilizer. So that would not be a good idea at all. And then we come to just how to build the aircraft. So if you look at a modern airline today, they tend to have these huge main landing gear, and they are always in the center of the aircraft, very close to the center of gravity, around the wings. Okay, so in most cases, the landing gear actuator unit is actually incorporated into the wings, and the landing gear gets folded up into the belly of the aircraft. But if you are going to use a tail drag, it means that the landing gear is going to have to be more forward. It's going to have to be forward of the center of gravity in order for this to work. And it's going to be, from just a structural point of view, from how to build an aircraft point of view, it's going to be very, very tricky to do. So those are some of the main reasons why we're not seeing any tail drag modern aircraft, and why we won't see any tail drag modern aircraft in any time soon. Guys, if you have more questions like this, things that you've been wondering about, noises or why an aircraft looks like that, whatever, then make sure that you send me a message. Either you put them in here in the comments below, I try to read through them as much as I can, or you contact me in the Mentour Aviation app, just tag @Mentour in the chat or in the forums and I'll be checking that out. I really appreciate the feedback that I'm getting from you. That's what I'm building this channel on. If you want to support me and the work that I'm doing and all of these videos that I'm churning out, consider joining my Patreon crew. Right? My Patreon crew, they get to preview my videos, they come with suggestions of what I should and shouldn't talk about. They give their opinions on thumbnails and many other things. I also do Zoom meetings with them. And if you're at the $10 per month level or up, then you also get a free premium membership inside of the Mentour Aviation app as a perk. So go and check out Patreon. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentour Aviation app and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.